Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Martin, as she said, co-founder of the Morbid Anatomy Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Rare Book Room, our first time. I don't know about you, at the Strand. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and new ones too. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we are celebrating the launch of the Anatomical Venus, Wax, God, Death, and the Ecstatic, an ambitious undertaking that was years in the making. It is a rare book with genius insight, brilliant observations, and gorgeous illustrations on every page. I'm honored to introduce the author of this seminal work, my co-founder of the museum, and the museum's creative director, Joanna Ebenstein, who will be joined in conversation by founding board member and the star of Science Channel's hit show, Oddities, co-owner of Obscura Antiques, Michelson. We have very long bios. This promises to be a thought-provoking, educational, and most certainly inspiring and somewhat titillating evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Michelson and Joanna Ebenstein, congratulations.
Don't mind these cords. We're recording for a podcast tonight as well.
All right, so we're going to assume the position. How does it sound? All right. Can you, yeah, that's loud. All right. I guess I'll start the conversation with full disclosure. Part of the reason I think that I'm here tonight with Joanna is way back in 2011, my life was turned upside down. I'm an antiques dealer. I have a shop in the East Village, and a TV show happened, and it was crazy, and my life was turned upside down, and it became very unreal and stressful and insane. And Joanna came to me one day, 2011, she said, "I have the best idea." She said, "Why don't we take this trip? We'll go to Italy and we'll explore this obsession, this mutual obsession we have with the preservation display of the human body, with the aesthetics of death and mourning and science and medicine and religion. Let's just do it." And it was like the best idea that I've ever heard. And I said, "Yes, please." And we took our first trip in 2012 and our second trip in 2013. And we landed in Milan, and we had the most enriching, intellectually fierce, incredibly visually stunning trip through history and death and science and mourning and religion. And every night we would discuss what we'd seen. And Joanna very, very, very wisely was there for the Venus. And the Venus was the focus of this trip. And it is all condensed into this book, this object, this perfect object through which she has traced science, history, philosophy, medicine, beauty, things both edifying and somewhat horrifying. And that was reading this book, it takes me right back to that trip. So we're going to have a conversation now about this book, but I just think of red wine and tortellini and walks in the freezing rain in Turin and all the things that gave birth to this. Well, Turin was pretty miserable. We kind of lost a little hope in Turin.
You lost a little hope in Turin.
Was that just me?
And it wasn't Turin, I believe it was Pavia.
You sure?
Yeah. Anyway, we won't get into that.
But anyway, this is what our conversations were like. So
how the book was forged.
Yes, the book was forged on this wonderful trip. And thank you again, Joanna, for straightening me out, because life became surreal and then it became grounded.
Well, thank you for wanting to come with me. I mean, this was a crazy idea. I just felt like if I wanted to understand the Venus, I had to go to Italy and kind of understand the context in which such a thing could be created. You look at these things and just think, how could they be? Why would they be? Who would create such a thing to teach a general public about anatomy? And when I I mentioned it to Evan. She said, that sounds amazing. Let's go. Who else would do that? So thank you.
Yeah, hooray for impulsivity and follow your dreams. So, to get the conversation just kicked off, on a very basic note, Joanna, can you tell us, where did you first encounter the Anatomical Venus, and then when did you fall under her spell?
In 2007, I got a commission to do an exhibition called Anatomical Theater, which is about medical museums around the world. And I went to your house, and I did some research. Evan very kindly opened her library to me, and La Specola was just one of the museums on my list. And so in that trip, I went to maybe 10 museums over the course of a month, and you just walk into that room and you see these incredible, what the photographs don't capture, there's not the right one up there right now, is that they're life-sized and that wax has this incredibly lifelike feel to it. So you encounter these things, and they have presence. It's very, very hard to explain and hard to capture in a photograph. So I guess I fell under its spell immediately. I think everybody does.
Love at first sight.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So, wow, I did not know that. So this, you say she's the perfect object. And she is, I agree, because everything is expressed in her. That's why you wrote an entire book. And it's so brilliant because it's about liminal ideas that are expressed in this one object. But do you feel that you understand her now that you have done this exploration both intellectually and physically?
No, but I feel like with any art project, maybe you don't actually want to ever understand it, or it's over to some degree. And I really wanted the book to reflect that too. I didn't want the book to explain it away. I just wanted to suggest all of the different paths that lead to and from the Venus. I feel like I could have worked on the book another 10 years and maybe longer, and it would never be done. But at a certain point, you just have to say it's over. I mean, it's not over, but the book is
It's
over.
never over.
It won't be, probably.
Because it's love.
Maybe so.
Yeah, but it was, as I took that trip, and for me it was we called it our anatomical pilgrimage. We were totally geeky about it. It was our anatomical pilgrimage. And to me it was a trip of learning. It was, Joanna actually, she found cities, positivist cities in Italy, everywhere where there were places of learning that had anatomical collections. So that was the basis of the trip. So we were hopping from museum to museum and church to church. So the sacred and the didactic were totally mixed in our experience, as they are mixed in the book. The book hops back and forth the way we actually hopped back and forth. And I remember when we were gathering this information, it seemed chaotic. And in the book, do you feel that you feel that you've sorted that a little bit, or it's still a little bit
I think
chaotic?
It's so complicated, I don't think you can make it simple. I feel like when we went to Europe, I didn't expect Catholicism to be a part of this, my journey at all.
Really?
No, or at least not as big a part. But I feel like if you're studying any object from a certain period in history, which is like the last 2,000 years, you have to understand Christianity to understand it. And when we went to these churches and saw all of these saints that look so much like the Venus, then you just start to be hit over the head with these similarities. So you have these saints with these ecstatic expressions. You have relics that are preserved body parts, exactly like what you're seeing in medical museums, but for very different reasons, but also very similar reasons, because they're both about health and the body, where you might pray to a saint to have your body part healed. There's so many similarities and so many overlapping strands. I don't think there's any clear way to talk about that stuff. And so, for example, when you read about the anatomical Venus in academic articles, which are usually history of medicine, this is just a side note, it's a footnote. But I feel like that's kind of the main point, as how I felt after our trip to Italy.
Yeah, and in Florence, we saw those specimens, those anatomical specimens that were couched on beautiful satin pillows. And they were like the missing link between the didactic and the sacred body. And we just felt that we actually had something solid, and then it all melts into air once you do a bit more reading.
But that's the great thing about pictures, is I feel like you can really beat yourself up trying to explain that, but when you have words and pictures together, I feel, what I love about the book so much, and this says much more about the designer than me, is that I feel you can leaf through it and get everything I'm trying to say just by looking at the pictures. And maybe without pictures, I don't think it would have been possible to tell this story at all.
Yes, agreed. Because you're visual.
But also I feel like these ideas we're talking about are so complex that there is no way to, without the visuals, I don't think you can even, I couldn't express them. I'm not sophisticated enough with language to express them without pictures.
Trying to describe the book and trying to describe our trip, it just sounds a little mad, because we're dashing back and forth between the spiritual and, again, the didactic. We're in teaching hospitals, we're in churches, and everything was inspiring and everything was somehow connected. And I had a hard time putting that into words, but it really works visually, and she's the perfect object through which to tell that story.
Yeah, and I think she's the perfect object because what I like to say is it's as if the torch is being passed at this point between different ideas of who we are, what human beings are, how to relate to death and how to relate to health, and it's passing from a spiritual Catholic model to a medical worldview. Mm-hmm. But it's still, they're both there. I'd say they're flickering in there almost equally. And I feel like part of what makes her so confusing is that she resides in a place where all of these categories that now are completely impossible to relate one to the other are still just effortlessly conjoined there. And religion and medicine, religion and science is one of them.
Right. The amelioration of suffering is what I really learned a lot from that trip. It was religion. It was, especially in that Church of the Votives that we accidentally ran into, which was one of the best things in the whole wide world. The amelioration of suffering was that was a spiritual thing, and then it became a physical thing, and then it became a scientific thing and a medical thing.
Right, but for a while it was all of those things, and that's when the Venus was made.
Yes.
And that's what I love.
Yes, exactly. And it's not only intellectual, it's aesthetic. That she is in that moment where everything was one. And it's a remarkable thing. And that history makes just looking at her so much richer. Because when she lies there without any information, she's just kind of mind-boggling. Like the first time you laid eyes on her.
Yeah, you just think, even at the museum, I should say, I meant to say this earlier on, if you like anatomical Venuses, if you care, we actually have 2 on display at our museum right now. I think they're the only 2 available to be seen in North America, so far as I know. Does anyone know any other anatomical Venus in the U.S.? No. So come to the museum. The show's been extended through August, so you can see one of these things. Not one of the best, I won't say that, but they're good enough that you'll get what this is all about. And I really would say, again, photos don't do justice. You have to experience it in person to see just how weird they are and how much impact they have and how much they'll, I hope, intrigue you as well.
Yeah, you have to see her in person. And one thing about the Venus is any of the Venuses, they're incredibly sensual and very erotic and entirely seductive. And they are seductive, sensual, and erotic for a reason, because they were drawing in the viewer and they were engaging.
I would argue with the word erotic.
Interesting.
I believe the eroticism that we see there is retrospective. I don't believe they were seen that way at the time that they were made.
Well, that is one of the points in your book that I find so fascinating. And I know when we visit St. Theresa in Rome, it really came to the fore, this notion that body language that reads as orgasmic or erotic wasn't read that way in the past.
Very, I don't know if you remember, but it was very much our trip to see Bernini, because is Megan here today? No. My friend Megan Fitzpatrick is a Catholic, and after we saw Bernini's St. Teresa, they also have an English translation of her diary that is illustrating, which is one of the most sexual things you've ever read.
Yeah.
And I sent it to my friend who's Catholic, and I can't even believe this. What is this? Can you read this in any other way? And she said, of course. And that's when I started to think, well, how could other people see this in another interpretation? And that's really what made me go down the path of trying to understand, why would that have been put in a church if people saw it as erotic at the time? And why would this have been the centerpiece of a public museum for men, women, and children if people saw it at that time? It wasn't outrageous. No one thought it was crazy. No one is saying, what the hell is this thing back then? Yeah. But they are today.
St. Teresa was talking about being penetrated abdominally by the Holy Spirit. And
golden spear thrust into her bowels.
That is correct.
By a beautiful angel.
Right, and then it brought her into this state of ecstasy that we all know from the Bernini statue. And the Venus is similarly, some of them are quite, their heads thrown back, their mouths are open, their hands are in a position of revealing. but that did not read that way, you don't think.
It just doesn't make
the 18th
sense.
century.
Like, if you look at the historical record, they wouldn't have been popular ways to teach a general public about anatomy if that was the case. They weren't made to teach doctors, they were made to teach men, women, and children, and they were used for that purpose. They were popular for that purpose, and visitor records are pretty uniformly positive. People were ordering copies for their own museums. So I feel like something has changed, and that's what I try to talk about a bit in the book.
Right, that is absolutely fascinating, because objects are time travel. So I'm an antiques dealer, and I know that objects, when they're created, are encoded with the sort of DNA of their time. And my favorite thing in life is finding something old and strange and puzzling and unraveling what it meant to the people who made it, the people who were looking at it. And the Venus is the perfect object through which to time travel. And when you actually go when you observe the Venus, and when you read everything there is to read about her, and when you contemplate her, she leads to everything. She leads to philosophy, she leads to history, she leads to sensuality, she leads to exhibition. You just picked the right object. I can't, of all the things we saw, she absolutely is the focal point. Do you think you picked her? Did she sort of pick you? Was it fate? Do you think she just consumed you?
I think she consumes a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think of all the objects in the history of medicine, that's partially why I used her as the focal point. When I was talking to Thames and Hudson originally about doing a book, this was before the museum, a long time ago, I thought it would just be a general book about medical museums, which is really where I started this interest. And then the more I thought about writing that book, the more I thought, that's a boring book to write. Like, I don't want to write it, I don't want to read it. Who's going to want to read that book?
Okay.
And I was thinking, is there one way to kind of talk about everything that interests me about the history of medicine and medical objects in one fell swoop? And I notice how people respond through my blog and now through the museum to photos of the Venus. And when they see it, they're just riveted, and they say, what is that? What was it used for? And nothing else from the history of medicine has that kind of power. So I thought, if you want to choose the perfect seductive object to draw people into the story you want to tell, the Venus is it.
She's still seductive.
We have two pictures at the museum, and people, when I docent in the museum, people just walk in and they start asking questions. There's no other, Letty, is there any other object you can think of in the museum that makes people that way? No, it's just that. So I felt like it was just the perfect hook for everything about these things that interests us.
They're medical. We saw so many different ways to preserve and display the human body, and so many of these things are simply horrific, or simply boggling for their ineptitude. But only the Venus was as beautiful. She was horrifying, which leads me to my favorite book review of yours from The Guardian.
Oh, that's my least favorite.
I know, but I love it because they called your book sumptuous and disgusting.
I do like that line, yeah.
Congratulations, because disgusting sells. So that is fantastic. And it was sort of a feminist read on the Venus.
Sort of.
And I went to Sarah Lawrence, and I'm a women's studies major, so I totally love this feminist back and forth that's happening in our culture, and the Venus is sort of the perfect object to discuss this sort of thing, because she's sort of the ultimate objectification of a female body. But she really is the end game, because she's prone, she's helpless, she can be violated by taking out her organs one by one. And to a certain extent, I actually agree with her assessment that she is the ultimate passive female victim. And she really was quite bothered by the fact that Venus is so beautiful, that they're beautiful. They're not ugly. These are perfect women. They're idealized women. Although most of the wax anatomies are idealized. And also the males are idealized. So it sort of loses its punch a little bit. But she said something really interesting where she said attractiveness and life are indivisible. And there was something dangerous about something dead being so entirely seductive. Do you think she's dangerous at all? Is that something you
Well, just on
thought
a
about?
pedantic note, she's not dead. I mean, that's the first point. She's depicted as if she's alive, and I think that's the key. You know, she's not a dead woman. That was an artistic choice.
Alive but eviscerated.
Dissectible or eviscerated, yes.
Yeah.
But her eyes are open. She's not in pain, which I believe is what the intention is of trying to make her look awake and all of those things. But do I think there's something dangerous? I honestly don't. I went to UC Santa Cruz, so I had the Sarah Lawrence type experience, and I went at the height of political correctness, and I just think it's a very one-dimensional response, and it's not taking history into account. I can see how a contemporary woman looking back can see that, but I don't believe that's what it meant at the time, and so I don't see it that way, is what I would say.
Yeah, it's clear from the book that you don't see
it's
it that
clear
way.
from the review she didn't read the book. Or she would have known my argument against that.
We're not going to edit that out, so.
No, it's okay.
Yes, and she really should see some of the male bodies because they are equally beautiful.
Though often skinless, which is why not many of them are in the book.
It crochets.
Yes,
that's true. There isn't the demountable male Venus, isn't.
Well, I think there were. I just don't think they've lasted because when I went and did research and looked at original catalogs, there are dissectible Adonises and dissectible Adams. They existed, but I have never seen one. So maybe the women are more interesting to the contemporary eye, so they lasted. I'm not sure.
But the thing about the Venus that we see, and especially the exhibition at Morbid Anatomy that everybody should go see if you haven't, is that it's, and you make a big point of this in the book, it's a fairground object as well. This is not just a very solemn medical specimen that is solemnly taken apart. This is something that was at a fairground that was a popular exhibition that was meant to be both edifying and titillating. And so there is that sort of aspect of voyeurism.
Yes, certainly spectacular and somewhat titillating. I'd say by the 19th century it becomes more titillating is what I think.
More so in the 19th and the 18th.
I think that's when it becomes more erotic to the contemporary eye. That's what I think. When you look at the Surrealists, that's when people are first, I believe, starting to see them as strange objects. In
the later part of the 19th century.
Later, yeah.
That's very interesting, because more has certainly changed. The 19th century was quite buttoned down and not quite so free and not quite so fun.
Unless you're in Italy, too. And I think that's something that we learned when we were in Italy as well, is that, it didn't really make the book, but when we went to Pompeii, and then we went to the Archaeological Museum in Naples, and we looked at those incredible, hyper-idealized, not erotic views of women, the statues. It suddenly hit me like, oh, duh. If they're going to make an anatomical model of a woman, it's going to be an idealized, beautiful thing, because that's what they do here, and they've been doing it for centuries, So just to say, I think that kind of buttoned-down, prudish thing is also an English and American thing more than it's an Italian thing. And the other thing I would say to that is when I was first doing that tour in 2007, I met a curator of a medical collection in London, and I was talking to him about, I'm really interested in looking at 18th century versus 19th century, so I'm going to go to La Specola in Florence. He's like, honey, that's not 18th versus 19th century. That's Italy versus Britain. And traveling around really that's what makes all of this so complex. It's so specific to this time and this place, and how do you talk about that and still make sense of the object?
Right. It's really about the Italian Venus and
Italian Catholic creation that has to do with natural philosophy. All of those things.
Precisely. And we only examined the Italian Venus, and that is what I learned, that sensual depiction of the human body, that very, very specifically Italian, and that the female saints are they're the Venus, but they're dressed.
Absolutely.
So she transcends. She's Italian as much as she is Catholic, as much as she is 18th century.
Yeah, that's what I would argue. Yes.
Yeah, and so some of the Viennese Venuses. They're
made by the same workshop.
Yeah. Are there any non-Italian workshop Venuses that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, later ones. The ones that we have at the museum are German.
Right. They're fairly sensual, but not as...
Yes. They're not as beautiful. From that era, there's nothing else I know that has survived.
And when we were in Naples and we both lost our minds completely and we entered this... other dimension, which, if you haven't been to Naples, go, and you'll lose your mind because it's the most beautiful place in the world. And we discovered that history of the Italian love of gesture. And it was in Ercole Lee's wax theater. It's in La Specola. It's, again, it's living. And even their deathly figures are sensual and alive, but not erotic.
I would argue.
I wish we could find someone from the 18th century and actually ask them, because it really bothers me.
You can read reviews. I mean, you can read what people wrote when they went there, and they talk about, I think one of the quotes in the book is a woman saying, a few miserable philosophers talk of the fact that there might not be a God, but when one goes to Fontana's wax models, they get down on their knees and pray to the God. So I think it's hard for people to understand that now, but there's this whole thing with natural philosophy before there was science, where to understand the body of man was to understand the mind of God. And whether it's just lip service that they're paying to this idea, it's in the parlance. And I do believe that religious element is very strongly in there and was read by people at the time in that way.
Yeah, and she's such a moral body. One of the places we visited, the Arciginazio, and if anyone's Italian, I apologize for my, the Arciginazio dissecting theater, where they had the carnival dissections. That was in Bologna. It's a magnificent, magnificent room. And the carnival dissections they happened during the time of carnival, and they were moral, it was a moral dissection. So they would have musicians, and everyone would be in costume, and there'd be torches, and they'd be dissecting this body, and it was the most surreal, incredible thing that you can summon up in your head. But they were dissecting criminal bodies, and the dissection was a moral lesson. So the dissected body is a moral body, and the Venus is a moral body. I'm making that leap. It may or may not, judging from your face.
I follow what you're saying.
Be true. So she was both sensual and moral.
Or if not moral, then instructive spiritually as well as physically, let's say. And I think a lot of those early displays, especially the ones in Bologna, remember the wax models in Bologna?
Yeah.
The wax, so in Bologna they have the first anatomical wax museum. It was founded by a pope who also, against what we ever believed was the case, suggested to his laity that they donate their bodies for science in the 18th century. And at the center is an anatomical Adam and Eve, wax anatomical Eve, and on either end of a series of écorchés that show the muscles being stripped off in successive layers is an angel of death made of a real human skeleton. Yeah. So there's a lot of this kind of imagery in early anatomical stuff that's a meditation on this idea of death in Catholicism, which is, it emerges through Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
And this comes up in early anatomical theaters, in anatomical illustrations, and also at the first museum. So I'd say there's a very strong moral element, for sure.
Yeah, and that's kind of lost on us now, but it was really, that Enlightenment Pope, he founded that natural history, he founded that museum, and he founded that anatomical theater. And it was teaching biblical precepts, and it was
cutting-edge science at the same time.
Exactly, and it works beautifully.
And this is another thing that I think that we now in our current day can't understand, how those two things could go together. But in the 18th century they did, and that's what's so fascinating to me about that time.
Yeah, agreed. Especially, America's a young country, but they're much more sophisticated about these things. I was going to say the old world, but that's a terrible thing to say. In the original world, where we all came from. And another thing about the Venus, and the thing that strikes you before you even know that you're looking at her, the way the brain processes things in the fraction of a second, is that she is the definition of the uncanny. She's the most uncanny object. She's between life and death. She's human and not human. And that, again, something you touched on in the book, which is fascinating, the notion that the uncanny itself is a modern construct. So the uncanny can only exist in a rational world. And the modern world is a rational world, although I think that's being debunked at the moment. But do you think the Venus was uncanny in her time, or is that...
I don't. I really believe that what that scholar said, that the uncanny happened slightly later. I just don't... people now look and say, what the hell is that thing? If she was uncanny if she read the way that she reads to us now, then that's what everyone would be saying when they went to La Specola. What is that? Why is this here? No, but they're like, this is great. It's a great way to teach anatomy to a general public. So I don't think people were tripping out on her back then.
But we're tripping out on her.
And we can't help but trip out on her because we've changed so much since then that she makes no sense.
Us super sophisticated modern viewers who have read everything and have had great educations and deconstructionist, post-deconstructionist theory are freaked out by this object that people at the time pretty much
said, hey, this is great.
Yeah, this is cool.
What a great way to teach anatomy.
Yeah, and that's another one of those great things that comes from the Venus. We've kind of slid backwards in a way.
I don't know if it's slid backwards. I just think our categories are divided in a totally different way now. And I think they'll look at our objects eventually and say, what the hell were they doing? It's invisible to us now because this is, our anatomical models is how we look at science now. This is the correct way to present science. That was the correct way to present science then. So I would just say there's all these ways that we now divide the world that didn't make sense to people at that time. One of them was probably religion and science or spectacle and education. Like, even at House of Wax, which is a show we have at Morbid Anatomy now, people will come in and they'll be like, well, I don't get it. So was it educational or spectacular? And I'm like, it's both. I'm like, both. Like, there are all these divisions we have that we think of as irreconcilably different categories, and she embodies so many of them, which I think is part of why she trips us out so much. And I would say creates, as we've talked about before, this kind of flicker.
Right.
So she flickers on the edges of all of these categories that we have in a way that I think is very pleasing to some people and deeply disturbing to others.
Yes, we live in a bubble, or at least I live in a bubble where everyone loves her. I have not met anyone
all love her.
Yeah,
you read the Guardian piece, come on.
Yes, and I greatly enjoyed it. Maybe this is a good way to teach anatomy. We should revive the panopticon and put it on the road, and then people could learn about their organs and demount this beautiful woman. I think that would get you in trouble in quite a few states.
We're doing it right now, and I think people are actually learning stuff when they come to our show. Like, people are very curious about the body.
Yeah, so they're learning the organs. You're getting feedback. Like,
yeah, well, I don't know if I'd say learning.
That's where the spleen is.
No, it's not like learning in that way, but more just visually try. Like, oh, this is this kind of surgery or that kind of surgery. It's not learning in a way that you're going to be able to go home and name things, but in a way that teaches you something visually that's really interesting. If that makes sense.
It's pretty great because she still works. Yeah, it's an old technology, the Venus, but she's still absolutely having a powerful effect. Well, we'll never get over her, probably.
That remains to be seen. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Now, you said something toward the end of your book that I found very interesting. We took our picture against Joanna's will, and I'm not showing it for her sake, but it was a great photo of Joanna and I setting out on our trip. And it was at my house, and I have a large monstrance, and I had a skull. And I thought, well, Joanna should be holding the monstrance because her sensibility is really more geared toward the mystical. And I'm a hardcore science geek, so I'll hold the skull. It was a great photo. And so, but I know that even though you say you were sort of surprised by the Holy Roman energy, I kind of saw that coming. But at the end of your book, you, in your summation, you say this, and this is a direct quote. Our attraction to the anatomical Venus appears to suggest by its very existence that archaic ways of thinking could be more relevant than we realize, that the spiritual or supernatural is not nonsense, and that the non-material realm should not be relegated to the mind. Can you explain that?
That was a highly edited version of what I said. So, what I think I was trying to say, what I would say is that I think going back to the idea of the uncanny and this idea of a time in which suddenly everything that wasn't rational or couldn't be measured or couldn't be seen with the physical eye becomes seen as nonsense. I think there are a lot of repercussions now from that attitude, and there's a lot of interest. We see it at the museum, and I see it with people I know in other ways of knowing and other kinds of experience, and that those kinds of ways of knowing are in the Venus and suggestive in a certain way, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. The spiritual and supernatural is not nonsense.
Not
And
necessarily.
We learn this through contemplation of something that we find compelling and beautiful, but that we can't quite put our finger on.
True.
I guess I agree with that, but I'll probably take that back in about
Well, it's recorded now,
5 minutes. That's true. Yes, the reactions to the Venus all exist in a realm that is not rational. She's not a...
Yeah, well, all art, I think,
Yes.
any good art takes you to a realm that's non-rational.
Agreed. And you brought up Hans Belmer, and I'm a huge Hans Belmer geek. Oh my God, I saw this exhibition in town where they had one of his dolls. I heard someone go, "Oh, yeah." Did you see the doll, the poupée?
Yes.
It was
They actually
incredible.
put security near the dolls because people wanted to.
Yeah, because it's an iconic object. And for those of you who don't know Hans Belmer, he was a photographer, a surrealist photographer. And he worked with this figure, this female figure, this doll. And it's...
He made them.
Yes, very, very ironic, and there's... The age of the doll is often in question, but it's an entirely... it's the female body at its most unprotected, vulnerable, dismembered, and violated is how I think of his work. And you mentioned him... Again, he's relevant to the story of the Venus.
Yes.
And surrealism, and can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's one thing I wanted to do with the book is explore what she suggests to us today and the end results of that. And I think the Surrealists were some of the first to see anatomical models the way that we do today. So you see early Surrealists obsessed with mannequins and these kind of bodies that they're taking these models and creating these crazy things out of them. I think they were the first, and when you read about, what's his name, Paul Delvaux, Paul Delvaux basically saw a breathing Venus at a fairground and writes that this is the time his art changed, and from then on, everything was based on the Venus. So that's when she first had this power to enchant, I think, in the way that we think of it in a contemporary way. And to me, the Surrealists are kind of watching our contemporary worldview take hold, if that makes sense, and the implications of the Venus starting to play out.
Yes, another thing that could only exist in a supposedly rational world, and the rise of the Surrealists coming, and they did during the chaos, the wartime, when everything became irrational, and they took that irrationality and expressed it, and in these figures. And so the Venus, once again, shows up in history as a mover and a shaker. Like that, and that is so fascinating. And again, as an unprotected female body that, and you also had that wonderful waxwork, the pinhole.
Yes, I was so happy. That's my favorite, probably my favorite artwork in the world. I don't know if you've all seen, well, one of them, Duchamp's Étendon. I'm sure I'm butchering the French. Yes, one of the best things ever, right? So has anyone seen it? Show of hands. Okay, for those who haven't, it's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You go and you find this, there's a giant wooden door, and you get on your, get on your tiptoes and peek through, and you see this crazy diorama of a woman, it looks like it's wax, but I've learned later it's not. And there's a moving waterfall behind it in this very creepy way. She's holding a lantern, and no matter how you move, you can't quite see what you need to see to understand what's going on. It's evocative, it's strange, it's just one of the best things ever.
Yeah, and she's in the book.
Yes.
Because
she's one of the best things ever.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and because
she's kin to the Venus.
Yeah, well, it's again the afterlives, I would call it, where the Venus goes in contemporary art, or not contemporary, but...
Yes, and then that fascinating chapter with the erotic dolls, where eroticism really does take over the inanimate female form in the most disturbing of ways. Maybe that's what The Guardian was reacting to, that
could be.
And that wonderful story.
Which wonderful
about
story?
the gentleman, his patient, and...
Oh, Ronnie's story. Von Cosel, yes.
Yes, von Cosel, which are people familiar with the von Cosel story? one of the most disturbing true tales ever. If you would like to just sort of...
Yeah, it's so a guy, you probably know the story better than I do. I wish Ronnie was here. A guy in the 1930s, 40s, he's a doctor from Germany. He treats a young woman who he believes he's met in a dream that is his love of his life, and he's not qualified to help her, but he's trying to help her for tuberculosis. She dies. He ultimately digs her body up out of the grave, takes it home, lives with it, scents it with various things, props it up while it begins to decay. It gets caught. The body gets buried. He then makes an effigy using her real hair and lives with it the rest of his life.
Yeah, and he had intercourse with
I was never, there's a lot of different stories on the internet. It's hard to know. I would say allegedly, but
I got that from Ronnie.
Yeah.
I'm gonna...
I don't know. Ronnie might have some more facts than I do. I couldn't get closer than saying allegedly.
But that whole chapter sort of fed into the helpless female form and the male gaze, and
again, that is what it means to us today. So I wanted to kind of go down that path as well.
So the Venus is a much more innocent. She is pure. She's sort of a spiritual body from that time when anatomy and the spiritual were much more closely aligned.
I do believe so.
Yeah, she avoids that kind of modern horror. But she's perfectly beautiful. There's nothing disturbing about her physically. She's not filthy. She's not violated. She is in a state of grace in every way. She's just a beautiful object. And the further forward you go in time and you find these female bodies that are unprotected, terrible things happen to them. But back in the 18th century, she was rather pure.
That's how I see it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time.
I think we're ready to wrap up. It's the indication I'm getting.
I see, that's the international wrap-up signal. Well, there's just one fascinating fact that you told me a long time ago, and it's kind of been rattling around in my head. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Judah ben Bezalel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he was sort of responsible for the Golem.
That's allegedly so. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. This is correct, right? Yeah. So my grandmother traced her lineage back to the rabbi who allegedly created the Golem to save the Jews in Czechoslovakia, in Prague.
Right, and a golem is, I've been terrified by golems all my life. I don't know, is everyone here familiar with the Golem?
Andrew, you're not familiar? Is that
Oh, I am.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a Jewish thing. Yeah, I know that movie. The Golem has terrified me for most of my life. He's a terrifying figure because he's barely formed, and it has a lot to do with Kabbalah. And it's so complex that you talk about it for hours, and like the Venus, you'll never get to the core of what it is. But it's sort of an unformed human figure that lurches, and it's right on the edge of, it's entirely uncanny, but it's not beautiful, it's dark, but it's protective. But it is this human figure that was summoned through...
An artificial human, absolutely.
Artificial human figure that was summoned through mysticism. And I just think that is quite a coincidence that you have spent so much of your life rather obsessed with these human figures that are summoned.
Yeah.
Maybe not through mysticism, but through art and science. And do you sense, is there something ancestral? Do you feel?
I don't know. My family, what do you think? You think there's something? No, they all say no.
No.
I guess not. I guess the answer is no.
I think there's something to the Golem. Because it is one of the most terrifying things I've ever encountered. And it's dark, but it's a savior. And there's just something there within Morbid Anatomy as well. I'm going to get to the bottom of that, I think.
Please do.
That'll be, I'll talk to your family. So are we now at 45? So there's a question and answer period for anyone who has any questions about anything, related to the topic.
Rachel.
Can I ask about, there's an image that it reminds me of the Von Cosel image, but it's like a woman who seems to be covered in like paper, feathers.
Oh, yes, that's a crazy story. So Oskar Kokoschka, you know, the expressionist painter, he was dating a woman and she broke up with him, and he had a full-sized effigy made of her from a doll maker, and he photographed it a bunch. He also went out to restaurants and theater with it, and that's it. He was really pissed off when it came back, and I think maybe he hadn't specified that part. It's unclear. I don't know, he was unhappy about that. I think it's like fuzzy, it's furry. Yeah, I think it's like a plush toy, kind of. Isn't that a crazy thing? But it looks, the pose is very Venus-like, which is, yeah. So. Yes?
Yeah, I know, you had a discussion earlier about sort of changing attitudes, viewing it, you know, through the context of eroticism. But I'm wondering about also nudity and nakedness and how it may have been viewed then or later, maybe especially as the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, also Italy versus the rest of the world, too. So I think, you know, there's naked women everywhere in Italy. And that's the other thing. When you walk around Florence, you just see statues of naked women everywhere. So I don't think people were very ruffled by nudity in 18th century Italy. But I do think, yes, in the 19th century, it starts to have a different meaning. And you can't really see bodies many places except the scientific or the art. And then I think that changes a bit. Wait.
This is fantastic, and I can't wait to read the book, and you may touch on this in the book, but I'm just curious if you relate this genre at all to the current obsession with body worlds and the different traveling competing exhibits, sort of modern crochets made of plastic.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, there was a guy in the 18th century named Fragonard who was related to the painter Fragonard, who was doing things just like Gunther van Hagens, who's the guy who does body worlds, is doing today in the 18th century. And I think it just hasn't changed a whole lot. People are still really interested in looking at dead bodies if you can find the right frame that makes it acceptable, you know?
Yeah, what's interesting about body worlds is, I don't really care for those preparations. They're not beautiful.
Yes, agreed.
And I don't like the texture of them and the pose, although that's just my opinion. But the wax as a substance, it's so magnificent and pure, and it raises them from that kind of, it raises them to the level of art.
Yeah. But Fragonard's, who's using a not dissimilar technique, his are much more interesting. I think it's kind of, he's just a bad artist. Or an uninteresting, Gunther van Hagens.
Gunther van
He's just not a
Hagen,
very interesting artist.
Body Worlds is one of the guys who worked for him and took the plastinization. But yes, it's based on the early ones where they use organic varnish, and those original Fragonard bodies are just spellbindingly beautiful. And there's something about the plastinization in Body Worlds. Yeah. And maybe the fact that they're playing basketball and riding skateboards, they're just nothing.
But it's interesting because the Fragonards were posed in ways that were like pop culture for their time, like biblical stuff, you know?
Agreed. But now we have skateboards instead of...
Yes, I know. Our pop culture
The Last
is very
Supper.
ugly. It's true.
Anyone else?
Can you talk about the correlation with the Venuses with those kind of ethnographic heads and depictions that are shown in the museum, and a couple of images came up with.
Yeah, so there were these old museums called panopticons, or dye museums here in the States, where they would have different kinds of things, including ethnographic waxes along with anatomical waxes. And the idea was that it was just a way to learn about different people around the world and different, and bodies and things like that. So it was seen as educational. They also do read not well today, I understand, but I believe in a time before photography, people were curious to see what different people of the world look like, and I can see how it's problematic, but I think it meant something different at the time as well.
And you think they're made later more towards the...
Those are more 19th century, yeah. But the Venuses we have at the museum are also 19th century. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Can you tell us about your favorite, please?
People always ask that. I'm really bad with favorites. I love the original, the dissectible Medici Venus, which is what we start the book out with. So that's the original one made in the 1780s, and you can lift her breastplate off and dissect her into 7 parts. I also love, there's a breathing sleeping beauty at Madame Tussauds in London that you can still see today from the 18th century also, and she's probably my other favorite.
Anyone else?
Question.
when they were created out of wax, are there artists identified who actually produced these? And was it a specialty? Was it how did that explain that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's part of the whole link that I try to make to religion as well. So in Florence, before these waxes were made, Florence was already really famous for anatomical wax ex votos. So basically you'd buy a replica of a body part made in wax, and these were supposed to be some of the finest in the world. There was a whole street that made them, and you'd offer them at the shrine of the saint. So basically if your arm was hurt, you put a beautiful wax arm there. Some people would actually, if they were rich, commission a whole effigy of themselves and leave it behind dressed in their clothes in the church. And so apparently the church was kind of like Madame Tussauds in Italy, and they didn't have a kind of secular waxwork. So there's a time when basically the Pope who founded the first anatomical museum, along with this Habsburg prince who comes in and ends up founding La Specola, which is where the Venus is, they abolish the use of wax in that way. And so I believe there are like these wax artists who have been working for centuries in this sacred form that just move right over to doing these anatomical medical waxes. And so the guy who made the most famous one, his name is Clemente Cecchini, and he was the head of the studio for, I want to say like about 60 years or something like that, and he made their most famous pieces, and he was a trained artist, and he taught at like the art university as well. And we know that he also made dying Christs for churches, and we also know that like some of the waxes we saw in the churches, like Ismelda in Bologna,
Yes, little Imelda.
that guy also made anatomical waxes. So I believe there was a real crossover between what you were seeing in churches and what you were seeing in the medical museum. So that's another reason I think why that language is so similar.
And a lot of them studied in the same schools, particularly down south and in Naples, where they really refined that's actually where they made crushed figures. So everywhere you walk in Naples, there are gestural human figures, and all matters sacred and profane. But a lot of them just studied anatomy and learned their craft, and then they went on to work in these two worlds.
Yes.
How many Venuses do you think you've seen?
10 maybe, I'm going to say.
Do you have any idea of how many you think there are?
I don't know of any that I haven't seen, but they might be out there. I hope maybe people will reach out to me when the book's out and let me know if they know of any. Yes?
Well, this image just spoke to us. I feel like I have to ask about the Titian Venus, because I feel like that is a famously very erotic image, certainly the way it was used upon by Manet and by other artists, and continues to be used as fascinating, and I think very eroticized. So I would be curious as to your perspective on this. Have you been reading it? This was like the Manet interpretation, very 19th century reading, and I think that perhaps that the woman who posed was a courtesan, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess I'm just curious about some of the sort of tangling of erotic and non-erotic and why you put that image.
The reason I put that image is part of the reason that it's said that they chose a Venus to create this wax model in the form of is that at the time that she was created, there was already kind of this grand tour tradition in Florence where you'd go to see all the Venuses. So you'd go to see Titian's Venus, you'd go to see Botticelli's Venus, and you'd go to see the Venus Medici. And so there's a scholar named Rebecca Messbarger who makes a really interesting point that perhaps what they were trying to do, this museum was founded by a Habsburg prince with progressive principles, and he had taken over in Italy that he saw as kind of decadent and falling to ruin. And he had created a science museum that he wanted to be a stop on the grand tour, and part of the device would be creating a Venus that was not just beautiful, but also instructional. So it was like his way of kind of entering the Venus path for the grand tourist, if that makes sense. As far as the eroticism, I don't mean to say there's zero eroticism in the Venus. All I'm trying to say is that I don't think it was primarily how it was read or understood at the time. Yes?
So you can scroll through, or so many of them were Italian, but you have a few in there that were Asian.
Oh yeah, that's not in the book. It was just some images that were evocative. Yeah.
Okay, so that's totally like.
Those are Japanese pregnancy dolls, and I just kind of thought for images going behind, it was evocative of the stuff we were talking about.
So that was just for that one.
I don't know much about it, to be honest. It was I found on the internet, and there was like a tiny bit of text, so I just don't know much about how they were used or when they were used. I just think they're really interesting images. Anyone else? All right. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.